The quote, "Development is the best contraceptive" by the former Minister of Population in India, Karan Singh, asserts the notion of the demographic economic paradox, a term that describes the inverse correlation between wealth and fertility within nations. This relationship is considered a paradox since nations with higher GDPs per capita can afford more children. However, in reality, these nations have been observed to have fewer children. In other words, richer countries have less children, contrary to Thomas Malthus's beliefs. In this Gapminder report, we will analyze China as a case study for this paradox through its volatile and turbulent political and economic history. Prior to the 1940s, China's fertility, number of children per woman, remained stagnant, with little to no fluctuation. However, in 1949, the Communist Party came to power along with many political and even more economic implications. Having inherited a nation recovering from the Second Sino-Japanese War, explaining the falling GDP, Chairman Mao Zedong had the goal of restoring China's economic health through reconstruction of infrastructures and nationalization of industry, and by 1952, inflation was under control. The distribution of land ownership had been equalized, and the production had returned to its previous peak levels, subsequently increasing the GDP per capita. This prompted the beginning of the first five-year plan from 1953 to 1957, where the focus shifted from rehabilitation to expansion through a Soviet-inspired economic model of socialism. Under this new model, China grew rapidly, creating industrial behemoth and rapid GDP growth. Here, as you can see, income per GDP falls and fertility increases. However, after this, despite the increases in GDP as the demographic economics paradox postulates, children per woman actually increase alongside GDP due to the introduction of a new variable. Mao Zedong had encouraged the population to procreate and develop the nation's manpower through unofficial policy of government propaganda. Contraceptives were both condemned and banned from importation. As a result, the number of children per woman continued to increase alongside GDP per capita.
The Great Leap Forward was an economic and social campaign by the Communist Party of China from 1958 to 1961. It was Mao Zedong's attempt to modernize China's economy so that by the year 1988, the country would rival the United States economically. He targeted industry and agriculture and came up with a 5-year plan. His modernization plan consisted in reforming China into a series of communes containing 5,000 families each. Everything was owned by the commune, and people had to give up their ownership of tools, animals, etc. The commune controlled the life of the individual. Workers were urged not only to meet the targets but also beat them. Although the quality of most were questionable, major constructions were built in record time. By the end of 1958, 700 million people had been placed into 26,578 communes. Consequently, life inside the communes became unbearable. Workers faced tasks they were incapable of achieving. Agriculture fell drastically from 1958 to 1959. The harvest that year was below what China needed at the most basic level, and in many parts of the country starvation occurred. By the end of this year, it was clear that the Great Leap Forward had failed. The Great Leap Forward was the deadliest famine in the history of China and the world. 300 million people died out of 600 million. As a result, birth rates also decreased. From 1957 to 1961, the birth rate went from 34% to 18%. People couldn't feed themselves, let alone their newborn babies.
In the late 1970s, China implemented a one-child policy. The policy was created to limit population growth and ensure that there were enough natural resources for the population. As seen in the graph, this caused a decrease in total fertility. The fertility rate never reached one child per person because there were many exceptions that were allowed. Many people claim that the one-child policy in China was unnecessary and that China's population growth would have slowed down naturally as the country's economy developed. The fertility rate in China actually begins to decrease before the one-child policy is implemented. India provides a good comparison to China since the economies of the two countries follow a somewhat similar path of economic development. The fertility rate of the two countries were very similar in the late 60s and early 70s. Initially, China's implementation caused an increase in the difference in fertility rates between the two countries. However, as India's fertility rate naturally dropped, the gap between the fertility rates of the two countries decreased. Since the 2000s, the fertility rate of India has only been slightly above that of China's. It seems likely that as the economy of India continues to develop, its fertility rate will further decrease, closing the gap between the fertility rates of the two countries. This gives support to the critics of China's one-child policy and their claims that such a policy was unnecessary for China. Recently, China has relaxed the limit so that all Chinese families can have at least 2 children. However, it seems like this change in policy will not have a great effect on fertility. It appears demographic trends have caused the fertility rate in China to remain low for the foreseeable future and perhaps permanently.